Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's journey into the shadowed halls of history, where crowns gleam with gold but are forged in blood. As you settle into the quiet of this evening, ready for slumber or a moment of tranquil reflection, I invite you to step with me into a world of ambition and sacrifice, where the pursuit of a throne was a dance with death itself. Before we begin, I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what hour of the night wraps around you. Share in the comments below if you wish. Your presence adds warmth to this shared tale of power's cost. If this journey through the blood-stained annals of royalty captivates you, consider subscribing to join us again for future evenings of storytelling, where we unravel the threads of history's tapestry. Now, let us cast our minds back to the medieval age, a time when kingdoms rose and fell on the edge of a sword, and a coronation was not merely a ceremony, but a declaration of war. In the stone-walled castles of Europe, from England's misty shores to France's golden fields, the crown was a prize soaked in blood, its weight measured in lives lost and loyalties betrayed. Picture a world where every coronation was a spark in a tinderbox, igniting rivalries that could burn entire realms to ash. The throne was no mere seat. It was a symbol of divine right, a beacon for ambition, and a magnet for treachery. To wear a crown was to invite daggers in the dark, for the path to power was paved with corpses, kings, queens, nobles, and commoners alike. But why, you might wonder, was the medieval crown such a crucible of violence? The answer lies not merely in human nature's darker impulses, but in the very fabric of medieval society itself. In an age where might truly made right, where the concept of legitimate succession was as fragile as parchment in flame, every throne was a contested prize. Unlike our modern world of constitutions and democratic processes, medieval kingship was a raw, primal affair, a constant test of strength, cunning, and ruthlessness. Imagine, if you will, the peculiar brutality of medieval inheritance law. Primogeniture, the right of the eldest son to inherit, was more ideal than reality in those turbulent centuries. Brothers murdered brothers for birthrights. Uncles disposed of nephews who stood between them and power, and bastard sons raised armies to claim what they believed was theirs by blood, if not by law. The crown was not simply passed down like a family heirloom. It was seized, fought for, and defended with the fury of cornered beasts. Consider the psychology of medieval nobility, raised from birth to believe in their divine appointment to rule. These were not men and women content to wait their turn or accept defeat gracefully. They were warriors bred for conquest, taught that God himself had ordained their superiority over lesser mortals. When such titanic egos collided over the ultimate prize, a kingdom's throne, the result was inevitably catastrophic. The medieval court was a viper's nest where every smile concealed a dagger, every feast might be one's last, and every alliance was as temporary as morning frost. The very ceremony of coronation itself was steeped in symbolism that invited challenge. When a new monarch was crowned, they weren't merely assuming a political office. They were claiming to be God's chosen representative on earth. Such audacious assertions demanded proof, and that proof was written in the blood of those who dared contest the claim. The oil of anointing was sacred, but it was the iron of the sword that truly legitimized a ruler's authority. In this world of shifting loyalties and blood feuds, even the most secure throne was never truly safe. A king might rule for decades, only to face rebellion from his own children, betrayal by his closest advisors, or invasion by foreign claimants who traced their lineage back through generations of forgotten marriages and disputed inheritances. The crown was not just a symbol of power. It was a target painted on the wearer's forehead, visible to every ambitious lord, every displaced prince, every mercenary captain with dreams of glory. The medieval battlefield, too, played its role in this bloody theater. Unlike modern warfare with its distant missiles and surgical strikes, medieval combat was personal, visceral, and decisive. When rival claimants met in battle, they fought not just for territory, but for the very right to exist. Victory meant coronation. Defeat meant extinction, not just for the claimant, but often for their entire bloodline. The stakes could not have been higher, the consequences more absolute. And were the innocent who found themselves caught in these royal tempests? Entire populations were swept up in dynastic wars, their villages burned, their harvests destroyed, their sons conscripted into armies that fought over names and bloodlines they barely understood. The cost of each coronation was measured not only in the blood of nobles, but in the suffering of countless common folk whose only crime was living under the shadow of a contested crown. As we delve deeper into these tales tonight, remember that we speak not of distant myths or fairy tales, but of real people who lived, loved, schemed, and died in pursuit of or in defense of power. Their bones lie silent now in forgotten graves, but their stories echo through the centuries, reminding us that the price of a crown was always, inevitably, paid in blood. Tonight, we'll explore why thrones were so often drenched in crimson, and what price was paid for the fleeting glory of a coronation. We'll walk through the shadowed corridors of power where every step forward required stepping over the fallen, and every crown was both prize and curse. Close your eyes, dear listener, and let us begin this journey into the heart of darkness that beats at the center of all earthly power. The echoes of our previous journey still linger in the shadowed corners of memory, where we glimpsed the fundamental brutality that made medieval kingship a dance with death itself. Now, dear listener, as you settle deeper into the darkness of this evening, let us witness how these principles of blood and betrayal played out in the flesh and bone of history. For it is one thing to understand why thrones demanded sacrifice. It is quite another to watch that crimson price being paid in the mud and mire of actual battlefields. In the medieval world, the quest for a crown was a perilous journey through a landscape of betrayal and violence. Imagine the year 1066 as England teeters on the edge of chaos. King Edward the Confessor lies dead, leaving no heir, and the throne is a prize contested by blood and steel. The very air seems to thicken with the weight of competing claims, each as sharp as a blade drawn in anger. Across the narrow sea, William, Duke of Normandy, claims the crown was promised to him. A promise sealed, he insists, with sacred oaths and holy relics. Meanwhile, Harold Godwin's son, England's most powerful earl, seizes the throne in a hasty coronation at Westminster, his crown still warm from Edward's death chamber. The stage is set for a clash that will reshape not merely England, but the very nature of medieval kingship itself. But William's claim to England was not his alone to contest. From the frozen fjords of Norway came Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, his longships cutting through northern seas like knives through silk. 3 men, 3 crowns in their minds, 3 armies preparing to paint English soil with blood. Harold Godwin's son, newly crowned and desperately clinging to legitimacy, faced the impossible task of defending his realm on 2 fronts. First, he marched north to meet the Norwegian threat, his Saxon FYRD, the citizen soldiers of England, following their king into what many sensed would be their final battle. At Stamford Bridge, Harold's forces clashed with Hardrada's Vikings in a battle so fierce that chroniclers claimed the river Derwent ran red for days afterward. The Viking king fell, pierced by English steel, his dreams of conquest dying with him on foreign soil. But Harold's victory was Pyrrhic. His army was bloodied, exhausted, and hundreds of miles from where William's Normans had already landed on English shores. The new king's celebrations were cut short by dire news. Norman banners flew on English beaches, and William the Bastard, soon to earn a far grander title, was already building fortifications and preparing for war. The forced march south broke Harold's remaining strength. His army, victorious but depleted from their northern campaign, stumbled toward Hastings like men walking to their own execution. They carried with them not just weapons and armor, but the crushing weight of England's fate. For this was no ordinary battle. This was a collision between two worlds, two ways of life, two concepts of what it meant to be king. The Battle of Hastings unfolds like a storm, with William's Normans charging against Harold's Saxon shield wall. The air is thick with the clang of swords, the screams of the wounded, and the stench of blood-soaked earth. Picture the shield wall, that ancient Saxon formation where men stood shoulder to shoulder, their limewood shields locked together like the scales of some great dragon, their spears bristling toward the enemy like deadly quills. For hours, this wall held, Norman cavalry dashing themselves against it like waves against cliffs, leaving behind the broken bodies of men and horses. But William was no ordinary duke. He fought with the cunning of a man who understood that crowns were won not just by strength, but by guile. His knights feigned retreat, drawing the Saxons from their defensive line, then wheeled and cut them down in the open field. Harold's brothers fell first, Gyrth and Leofwine, cut down defending their king. Then, as the day wore on and the Saxon line began to crack like ice in spring, came the moment that would echo through centuries. Harold himself, struck down by Norman steel. Some say an arrow found his eye. Others claim he was hacked to pieces by William's knights. The truth matters less than the result. England's last Saxon king lay dead, and with him died 1,000 years of Anglo-Saxon rule. By day's end, Harold lies dead, an arrow through his eye, and William, soon to be called the Conqueror, claims the English throne. But his coronation on Christmas Day, 1066, is no moment of peace. As he is crowned in Westminster Abbey, the sacred space where English kings had been made for generations, his Norman soldiers wait outside, their hands never far from their sword hilts. When the abbey fills with the traditional acclamation, the roar of Vivat Rex that proclaimed a new king, the Normans mistake these cheers for rebellion. In their panic and suspicion, they set fire to nearby homes, turning the sacred day into a scene of panic and slaughter. Even William himself, that iron-willed conqueror, trembled at his own coronation as screams echoed from the streets and smoke began to fill the abbey. The throne is won, but at what cost? Thousands lie dead, and England's Saxon nobility is shattered, its people yoked under Norman rule that would reshape their language, laws, and very identity. Across the Channel, the French crown was no less bloodied, though its wars were often more intimate, more personal in their brutality. In the 12th century, the Cape Town kings fought to consolidate power over fractious nobles, each coronation a fragile assertion of authority over lords who saw themselves as kings of their own domains. Consider the tale of Louis VI, known as Louis the Fat, whose coronation in 1108 was overshadowed by the constant threat of rebellion. His vassals, hungry for power and jealous of royal authority, waged private wars from their stone keeps, their castles bristling with defiance like thorns on a rose stem. Louis spent his reign crushing these upstarts, his sword dripping with the blood of his own countrymen, all to secure a throne that was never truly safe. Each victory required another campaign, each submission bred new resentment, and each crown worn in Paris cast shadows of rebellion across the French countryside. But the cost of coronations was not borne by kings alone. The common folk, peasants toiling in muddy fields, women weaving by dim hearths, children who knew no world beyond their village boundaries, paid dearly for the ambitions of their betters. Armies trampled crops as casually as they trampled men, requisitioned food from granaries that meant the difference between survival and starvation, and left villages empty of young men who would never return from distant battlefields. In times of succession disputes, like England's anarchy, 1135 to 1154, rival claimants like Stephen and Matilda turned the countryside into a battlefield where mercy was as rare as safety. Castles were besieged until their walls cracked like broken teeth, towns burned until their timbers gave way to ash and ember, and countless innocents were caught in the crossfire of noble ambition. A chronicler of the time wrote, with bitter accuracy, "The land was filled with plunder and burning, and men said openly that Christ and his saints slept." And then there were the unseen victims, the women and children of noble houses, pawns in the Game of Thrones whose suffering rarely found its way into the heroic songs of victory. Imagine young Eleanor, a fictional daughter of a fallen lord during the anarchy. Her father, loyal to Matilda's cause and believing in the righteousness of a woman's claim to rule, is slain by Stephen's forces as his castle burns around him. Her family's lands are seized, their wealth scattered like grain before the wind, their very name becoming a whisper of treason. At 12, she is betrothed to a brutal baron to secure an alliance, a man 3 times her age whose previous wives have died under mysterious circumstances. Her dreams of freedom, of choosing her own path, are drowned in the cold reality of dynastic politics, where even grief must serve the cause of power. Her story, though imagined, echoes the fate of countless women whose lives were sacrificed to the ambitions of men vying for crowns they would never live to enjoy peacefully. The rising tide of blood reached beyond the battlefield into the very heart of royal courts, where coronations often sparked purges as merciless as they were methodical. New kings, understanding that mercy was often mistaken for weakness, eliminated rivals with the precision of surgeons cutting away diseased flesh. In France, the young Philip Augustus, crowned in 1179 at the tender age of 14, faced plots from his own uncles, who coveted the throne and saw in his youth an opportunity to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. His reign began not with celebrations, but with intrigue, as spies and assassins prowled the royal court like wolves in winter, their daggers gleaming in the torchlight of corridors where shadows held more secrets than the light revealed truths. The throne was a magnet for betrayal, and every coronation was a gamble with death, not just for the king, but for everyone whose fate was tied to the crown's weight. As we pause in our journey through these blood-soaked chronicles, dear listener, remember that we have only begun to glimpse the true cost of medieval kingship. The battles we have witnessed, the lives we have counted, the suffering we have catalogued. All of this is merely the rising action in a drama where the stakes grow ever higher and the price of power ever steeper. We have traveled far together through this darkening tale, dear listener, watching as the seeds of violence we first glimpsed in those ancient halls of power took root in English soil and French fields. We have witnessed the terrible logic of medieval kingship play out in conquest and betrayal, in the screams of Hastings and the smoke of burning villages. But now, as our journey reaches its crescendo, we must steel ourselves for the ultimate revelation of what crowns truly cost. For there are moments in history when the thirst for power becomes so consuming, so absolute in its demand for sacrifice, that entire generations are fed into its maw. The cost of a coronation reached its zenith in moments of cataclysmic violence, where the thirst for power drowned entire kingdoms in blood. Let us journey to 15th century England, during the Wars of the Roses, a brutal struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York for the English throne. Here, in this torn and bleeding realm, we witness the medieval principle of contested succession pushed to its most horrific extreme. This was no longer merely about rival claimants or disputed inheritances. This was about the complete annihilation of one royal bloodline by another, a struggle so vicious that it would devour the very nobility it sought to crown. The year is 1461, and England has become a kingdom at war with itself. The crown is a prize contested by two young kings, Henry VI, a frail and pious Lancastrian whose gentle nature made him beloved by monks but despised by warriors, and Edward IV, a charismatic Yorkist warrior whose towering frame and golden hair made him appear like some ancient Saxon king reborn. Between them lay not just the throne of England, but the future of medieval kingship itself. For this war would prove that crowns could demand not just individual lives, but the sacrifice of entire bloodlines, entire ways of life. Henry VI madness, whether born of divine visions or mortal frailty, had left England rudderless in a storm of ambition. His queen, the formidable Margaret of Anjou, fought like a lioness to preserve her son's inheritance, but her foreign birth made her a target for xenophobic nobles who saw in a Yorkist cause a chance to reclaim England for the English. Edward, Duke of York, had died at Sandal Castle, his head mockingly crowned with paper and displayed on York's walls. But his son Edward took up the banner with a fury that would reshape the kingdom. The Battle of Towton, fought on a snow-swept Palm Sunday in 1461, becomes the bloodiest day in English history, a day when the very concept of chivalric warfare died, screaming in Yorkshire snow. Over 50,000 men clash in a frozen field, more soldiers than had ever before gathered on English soil, their swords hacking through armor grown brittle in the bitter cold, their breaths steaming in the icy air like the souls of the already dead rising to heaven. This was no orderly medieval battle with its formal challenges and knightly courtesies. This was slaughter elevated to art, brutality refined to science. The Lancastrians, loyal to Henry and led by seasoned commanders like the Earl of Northumberland, arrive believing their superior numbers will carry the day. But they reckon without the treacherous winds that blind them with driving snow, turning their own arrows back upon them like the judgment of an angry god. Edward's archers, shooting with the wind at their backs, rain death upon the Lancastrian ranks with a precision that transforms archery into mass execution. Yet even as men fall by the hundreds, the battle is far from over. When the arrow storm ends, the real horror begins. The field dissolves into a melee so savage that chroniclers struggle to find words adequate to its description. Knights tear at each other with daggers when their swords break. Common soldiers bite and claw like wild beasts, and the snow beneath their feet is trampled into a crimson slush that clings to armor and flesh alike. The Earl of Northumberland falls, hacked down by Yorkist axes. Lord Dacre dies with 17 wounds, his banner torn and bloody in the slush. The Lancastrian line breaks not once but repeatedly, only to reform and die again. By dusk, the field is a charnel house beyond comprehension, with estimates of 20,000 dead, nobles, knights, and common soldiers alike reduced to meat and memory. Rivers, it is said, ran red with blood for days, and the snow was stained crimson for miles in every direction. Local chroniclers claim that wheels of watermills downstream were clogged with corpses for weeks, and that the stench of rotting flesh hung over Yorkshire like a curse. Edward's victory secures his coronation, but the throne he claims is soaked in the lifeblood of a generation. When he is crowned at Westminster, the golden crown seems to drip with the phantoms of Towton's dead. But Towton's horror extended far beyond the battlefield itself. The human toll is staggering in ways that mere numbers cannot capture. Widows mourn in shattered villages where every family has lost fathers, sons, brothers. Entire bloodlines ended in a single afternoon. Orphans beg in the streets of towns that can barely feed their own, while the land lies fallow as farmers' bodies rot unburied in distant fields. The chronicler John Pothun wrote with heartbreaking simplicity, "The dead were so many that they could not be numbered, but behind his restraint lay a truth too terrible for medieval minds to fully grasp. An entire social order had died at Toten. Yet Edward's crown brings no peace, for crowns won in blood demand constant nourishment of the same. His reign is plagued by rebellions as Lancastrian survivors plot their return, and paranoia seeps through the royal court like poison through wine. His own brother, George, Duke of Clarence, betrays him in a desperate bid for power, allying with the Earl of Warwick, the very man who had made Edward king. When George's treachery is discovered, Edward shows him the same mercy that medieval kings reserved for family members who dared reach for crowns. He has him drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, turning even execution into a mockery of noble taste. The throne remains a curse, its luster dimmed by the blood it demands from friend and foe alike. Consider the story of Margaret, a fictional weaver's wife in a Yorkshire village whose world is shattered by forces she cannot understand or control. Her husband Thomas, a skilled clothworker pressed into the Lancastrian army, marches south with promises ringing in his ears about fighting for rightful kingship and English liberty. She never sees him again after Toten. He dies in the snow with an arrow through his throat, his last thought not of Henry VI or royal legitimacy, but of Margaret's face and the children who will now face winter without their father. Left with 3 children and a loom that produces cloth no one can afford to buy, Margaret faces starvation as Yorkist soldiers pillage her home, claiming whatever they fancy as spoils of war. Her store of wool is seized, her copper pots melted down for weapon making, and her eldest son Robin, barely 13 with his father's steady hands and gentle eyes, is pressed into service as a page in a Yorkist war camp. She begs them to leave her this one child, offering herself in his place, but soldiers drunk on victory and blood have no ears for a weaver's pleas. Robin survives the camp's brutality for 3 months before dying of fever, calling for his mother in delirium while lying on straw soaked with the waste of other dying boys. Margaret's grief is a silent scream that echoes through empty rooms where her children once played, one of countless unheard voices buried beneath the pomp of coronation ceremonies and the triumphant songs of royal minstrels. Her second son flees to become a beggar in London's streets, while her daughter is married off at 14 to a man who will beat her for the crime of bringing no dowry to their bed. This climax reveals the true cost of the crown in all its terrible arithmetic. Not just the lives lost in battle, but the dreams crushed under armored hooves, the families torn apart by royal ambition, and the societies fractured beyond repair. The throne was indeed a siren's call, luring not just men but entire civilizations to ruin and nations to despair. Every jeweled crown, every anointed king, stood atop a pyramid of corpses whose sacrifices were forgotten in the shadow of royal glory, their names unremembered in the chronicles that celebrated the victories built upon their bones. Edward IV crown gleams bright in Westminster's light, but in the darkness beyond those sacred walls, England bleeds from wounds that will take generations to heal. The Wars of the Roses will continue for another 24 years, claiming 2 more kings and countless thousands more lives, all for the sake of determining which bloodline has the right to sit upon a throne that has become less a seat of governance than an altar demanding endless sacrifice. And so we reach the summit of our dark mountain, dear listener, where the cost of coronation stands revealed in all its stark brutality. The price of a crown is not merely blood, but the soul of the very kingdom it claims to rule. In the aftermath of such cataclysmic violence, dear listener, when the screams have faded and the snow has finally washed clean of blood, we might expect only silence, the terrible quiet that follows the storm's passing. Yet history teaches us that from even the most barren battlefields, life finds a way to emerge, scarred but unbroken. As we descend from the bloody peak of Totten and witness the long shadow it cast across England and beyond, we discover something perhaps more profound than the violence itself: the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure, adapt, and ultimately transcend the darkness that power's pursuit leaves in its wake. As the blood of Totten soaked into the earth, staining Yorkshire soil for generations to come, the echoes of Coronation's cost lingered like the tolling of funeral bells, but so too did the resilience of those who survived. The Wars of the Roses did not end with a single battle, no matter how decisive or devastating. The carnage of 1461 forced a reckoning with the fundamental nature of English kingship, but it did not resolve the deeper contradictions that had made such slaughter inevitable. Edward IV, now king by right of conquest and coronation by divine sanction, sought to rebuild a fractured England from the bones of the old, but his throne remained as precarious as ice over rushing water. The young king, for all his martial prowess and undeniable charisma, discovered what every medieval monarch learned: that crowns won by the sword must be defended by the sword in perpetuity. His court became a place of constant vigilance, where every feast might conceal a conspiracy, every alliance might mask betrayal, and every moment of peace was merely preparation for the next war. Edward's paranoia was not madness but wisdom. He had seen what happened to kings who trusted too freely, who believed their crowns made them invincible. Yet even as Edward struggled to consolidate his blood-bought throne, rivals like Henry VI's Queen, Margaret of Anjou, fought on with the fury of a woman who had lost everything and therefore had nothing left to lose. Exiled to the court of her cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, Margaret raised armies with the desperate efficiency of someone who understood that her son's future, her entire family's survival, depended on reclaiming what had been stolen at Totten. Her heart, hardened by the loss of her husband's sanity and her kingdom's loyalty, became a forge where grief was transformed into implacable determination. Margaret's campaigns from exile were exercises in futility, doomed from the start by lack of resources and the English people's war-weariness, but they speak to something more profound than mere political ambition. Her defiance, though ultimately futile, speaks to the unyielding spirit of those caught in the crucible of power, who refuse to accept that might alone makes right. She represents the medieval world's tragic heroines, women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda the Empress, or Blanche of Castile, who wielded power in a world designed to deny it to them, who fought not just for crowns, but for the principle that legitimacy meant more than the ability to kill. Her final invasion, landing at Weymouth in 1471 with a ragtag army of French mercenaries and English exiles, was less a military campaign than a desperate gamble. At the Battle of Tewkesbury, her son Edward, Prince of Wales, the boy for whom she had sacrificed everything, was cut down in the melee, his blood joining the countless thousands already spilled for the Lancastrian cause. Margaret's capture and subsequent imprisonment marked not just the end of Lancastrian hopes, but the conclusion of an era when royal women could command armies and challenge kings through force of arms alone. Yet amidst the wreckage of kingdoms and the ruins of dynasties, glimmers of hope emerged like spring flowers pushing through winter's frozen ground. The medieval world, for all its brutality and casual acceptance of violence as a political tool, gave rise to voices of reason and reform that would echo across centuries. Consider the remarkable story of Christine de Pizan, a 14th-century French writer who, though not directly tied to the bloody business of coronations, challenged the fundamental assumptions that underpinned royal politics and the masculine monopoly on power. Widowed at 25 and left impoverished with 3 children and a mother to support, Christine faced the choice that confronted countless medieval women: remarriage to a man who might abuse or abandon her, or destitution in a world that offered few opportunities for independent women. Instead, she chose a third path that seemed impossible. She turned to writing, producing works like the Book of the City of Ladies, which championed women's dignity and intellectual capacity in a world that saw them as pawns in dynastic games or ornaments in masculine courts. Her pen became a quiet rebellion against the bloodshed and patriarchy that defined the quest for thrones, offering a vision of a more just society where worth was measured by wisdom rather than warfare. Christine's writings, circulated in manuscript form throughout the courts of Europe, carried ideas that were revolutionary in their implications. She argued that women possessed the same rational capacities as men, that violence was not inherently noble, and that true governance required justice and mercy rather than mere strength. Her Book of the Body Politic outlined principles of good government that emphasized the ruler's duty to his people rather than their obligation to serve his ambitions. These were dangerous thoughts in a world where kings ruled by divine right and maintained power through the sword. The common people, too, found ways to endure and even flourish despite the constant threat of war and the demands of their royal betters. Festivals like the Feast of Corpus Christi brought communities together, their songs and dances a defiant celebration of life amidst war's devastation. These moments of joy, however fleeting, were testaments to human resilience, much like the myths of ancient Greece that sustained its people through dark ages. Village festivals became spaces where the normal hierarchies of medieval society were temporarily suspended, where peasants could mock their lords through licensed fool plays, and where the cycle of agricultural life was celebrated as more enduring than the rise and fall of kings. In England, bards told tales of King Arthur and his Round Table, weaving legends of a noble ruler whose court promised justice rather than conquest, fellowship rather than feudalism. These stories, growing ever more elaborate with each telling, offered an implicit critique of contemporary kingship. Arthur's court, as imagined by medieval storytellers, was everything that real royal courts were not: meritocratic rather than hereditary, peaceful rather than warlike, just rather than arbitrary. The Arthurian romances became a form of political fantasy, allowing people to imagine what kingship might look like if crowns were earned through virtue rather than violence. Philosophers and reformers began to question the divine right of kings, sowing intellectual seeds that would blossom centuries later into concepts of constitutional monarchy and popular sovereignty. John Wycliffe, a 14th-century English theologian and Oxford Don, challenged the Church's role in legitimizing bloody coronations, arguing for a return to spiritual purity that would necessarily require political reform. His ideas, that the Church had been corrupted by temporal power, that kings ruled legitimately only insofar as they served God's will, and that the common people had a right to judge their ruler's virtue, were heretical by the standards of his time. Wycliffe's followers, known as Lollards, carried his ideas throughout England despite severe persecution. They preached in English rather than Latin, making religious and political ideas accessible to common people who had been excluded from scholarly discourse. Their emphasis on personal piety and social justice offered an alternative to the spectacle of royal power, suggesting that true authority came from moral worth rather than noble birth or military might. These voices, though drowned out by the clash of swords and the ceremonies of coronation, were the first whispers of a world where power might be earned through merit rather than murder. The story of Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who helped crown Charles VII of France in 1429, embodies this resilience and points toward the transformation of medieval kingship. Guided by divine visions that told her God had chosen her to drive the English from French soil and see the Dauphin properly crowned, Joan led French armies to victory with a courage that bordered on the supernatural. Her presence on battlefields transformed French morale, turning a demoralized rabble into an army that believed itself invincible because it fought for a cause blessed by heaven itself. Joan's success in lifting the siege of Orleans and clearing the road to Reims for Charles's coronation represented more than military victory. It demonstrated that legitimacy could come from popular acclaim and divine sanction rather than merely hereditary right or martial prowess. When Charles was crowned in Reims Cathedral with Joan standing beside him in armor, the ceremony carried a different meaning than the blood-soaked coronations we have witnessed. This was a crowning that claimed to represent the will of God and the French people rather than simply the triumph of one faction over another. Yet Joan's reward was betrayal of the cruelest kind. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English, she was sold like a commodity and subjected to a show trial that revealed the naked cynicism of political power. The same church that had blessed Charles's coronation condemned Joan as a heretic and a witch, demonstrating how religious authority could be manipulated to serve temporal interests. Her execution by burning at the stake, carried out when she was only 19 years old, became a symbol of how the medieval world destroyed those who threatened its established order, even when, or especially when, they did so in the name of higher justice. Joan's courage, like Christine's intellect and Margaret's defiance, shows that even in a world of blood-soaked thrones, individuals could rise above their circumstances, their legacies enduring long beyond the grave. These figures represent the seeds of a different kind of power, one based on moral authority rather than brute force, on service rather than domination, on the consent of the governed rather than the accident of birth. As we witness this falling action in our dark drama of medieval kingship, we see the old order beginning its slow transformation, wounded by its own excesses and challenged by new ideas about the nature of legitimate authority. The blood is still wet on the crown, but voices are beginning to whisper that perhaps there might be another way. As we draw our journey through the blood-soaked thrones of medieval Europe to a close, let us reflect on the lessons carved in the stone of history. The coronations of kings and queens, glittering with pomp and ceremony, were built on a foundation of sacrifice. Nobles felled in battle, peasants starved in war-torn fields, women and children traded like coins for power. Yet from this crucible of suffering emerged a legacy of resilience, wisdom, and hope that still speaks to us today. The story of medieval coronations is a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition. From William the Conqueror's fiery crowning to Edward IV's blood-drenched victory at Towton, the throne was a prize that demanded lives as its currency. But it also teaches us the power of the human spirit to endure and resist. Figures like Joan of Arc and Christine de Pizan, though separated by time and circumstance, remind us that even in the darkest ages, individuals could challenge the tide of violence and oppression, lighting a path toward a better world. Today, we live in a world far removed from the brutal calculus of medieval crowns, yet the echoes of that era linger. Power still tempts with its siren call, and the weak still bear the brunt of the strong's ambitions. As we drift towards sleep, let us honor the forgotten. Those like Margaret, the weaver's wife, whose silent suffering underpinned the glory of kings. Their stories urge us to build a world where power is wielded with justice, where no one's dreams are crushed for another's crown. If this tale of thrones and blood has stirred your heart, join us again by subscribing and share your thoughts in the comments below. For now, dear listener, let the weight of history ease you into slumber. Dream of a world where the sacrifices of the past fuel a future of compassion and equality, where thrones are no longer soaked in blood, but built on the shared dignity of all. Good night, and sweet dreams until we meet again.